Dr. Liz Burton-Crow. I'm the Director of Education for the Kurla Center for Nonviolence. Welcome back to Living One, our free monthly webinar series where presenters from around the world share their vision about psychology, life, and culture in the absence of animal exploitation. Through Living One, we attempt to answer the question, we know what's wrong, but what does right look like? This month, we welcome Susan Grelock-Yusem, PhD, a depth-based eco and community psychologist living in the Pacific Northwest. Her research has focused on arts-based methodologies for conservation communication and human-wildlife coexistence. She has more than 20 years of experience working in communications in the organic food movement and has also worked as a nature guide, art therapy assistant, and program evaluator for arts programs. She currently serves as Vice President of Communications and Marketing for the Seattle-based conservation nonprofit Forterra. So thank you so much for joining us today, Susan. We're really happy to have you here. And as always, she'll be interviewed by our very own Dr. Gabe Bradshaw.
Hi, everyone, and welcome again. And Susan, thank you so much for being here. This is really a treat. I have to say that there are three of us, at least, Liz, me, and Susan, all graduated from Pacifica Graduate Institute and are, saturated in depth psychology, which is really the sort of the inclusiveness of the unconscious, and was the progenitor of the concept of eco-psychology and later trans-species psychology. So this is really a wonderful time. So Susan, thank you for being here. Now, although you've been a vegan, right, and a plant-based eater for 30 years, a lot of your work more recently or prior, maybe before, has been working with wildlife and human communities at that interface. Do you want to give us a little bit of an arc of your experience that has brought you here?
Sure, and I think it's interesting to talk about my roots even in childhood, because part of my work has really been thinking about personal identity and how we can shift consciousness of who we are and our own identity as kind of fundamental to the work we're trying to do. So I think at this point in my life, it's interesting to look back 30 years and think about, look back beyond 30 years, think about my childhood and my deep connection with other species and how I was able to respond to that and how my family was open to that and how I was able to really understand a deeper sense of connection with other animals. And it's interesting to me to remember even making that shift to becoming a vegan when I was 13 and living in a small community that I didn't know anyone who was vegan. I just came upon it in a book and read about it and thought, wow, that's me. That's my cultural identity in a sense. And it's especially been interesting to look back after seeing it evolve and being involved in the organic food movement and the change in the way we think about food in Western culture, and to really see how that has evolved. And it actually gives me a lot of hope when you think making a small personal change and not really thinking it'll have a large impact, but really looking back in your own lifetime and seeing how that's actually, there have been cultural shifts that have happened.
Well, it's an interesting insight that you have, because our last speaker, Krista Hedema, who's very active in the animal rights movement for as long as you have been a vegan, and she's very much engaged at sort of all different levels in terms of largely farmed animal rights. And her perception is that the movement, when it's multifaceted, so we'll just call it the movement, things that are really changing, and you talked about identity, we can maybe expand this notion of animal rights and things like that to really look at it in a broader sense of that challenge to the human psyche, the Western human psyche, which started to deviate or did its thing centuries ago, millennia, whatever it is. And so from that broader perspective, she considers from the animal rights perspective that, quote unquote, we're not, she didn't say this, I'm saying it, we're just not making it, we're not doing what we need to be able to do. And her feeling is that the animal rights movement has been somewhat limited. But I'd like you to talk about this, perhaps bring that in from your own personal experience and the perspective of depth psychology and this notion of identity, and how you see that there's an amazing kind of a shift or catalyst for making a change, which has been around the past paradigm for millennia.
Yeah, one thing that I've come to realize is that you really don't know how things will turn out. You really can't. We have to respond to our own calling. Like fundamentally, I think, especially as a depth psychologist, the most important thing we can do is to really understand our calling and respond to that, and also help others respond to their own calling. And trying to understand or think rationally about why you do that, or how that will turn out, or what the outcome would be is good to give you some sense of like where to move forward. But it's also very limited, because there's, we have to be aware of our own tendency, our own hubris as humans, and understand that we really don't know how things are going to turn out. It'll get you to the next step, but it almost never works out the way you thought it would work out. Like, I think veganism is a good example. It's such a small incremental part of the population, but probably one of the bigger shifts might happen with things like the Impossible Burger that are suddenly reaching a much larger audience, and have other issues fundamentally that I might challenge, but are actually unexpected shifts that are changing the way people eat and dependence on animal food in an interesting way. But I think, go ahead. One thing that I think has been really useful for me, something that a tool in psychology, is to do a geniogram, or a diagram of your own tree of who you are. I think that's a nice activity that anybody can do to really understand you and how you are situated in this place and time, with your culture and your class and your family origins and your own personal identity. Because I think when you do that, it seems like a simple activity, but when you look back and take a lens of connection with other species or connection to land, if you look back over the last few generations of your life and really mapped out your parents and your grandparents and even your great-grandparents and what their connection to land was, or to food, or connection to other species, you get a much better conscious sense of who you are and where you've come from. And I think that's something that challenging and shifting the way we're eating is actually brings up in a really real way. And I think when we do that personally, we actually own who we are and what we're about, and we're much less likely to project onto other people, other species, or romanticized ideas or prejudices, and it really actually helps you kind of fully own who you are supposed to be.
It reminds me of years ago, I saw a therapist, and one of the first sessions she said to me was, okay, I want you to think back, describe, a typical day for you at my age. I've forgotten what it was. And then she said, okay, now I want you to think about what was a typical day for your mother at that same age. And so we kept going back, your grandmother, and I followed my mother's line, which is Danish. Anyways, I went back 5 generations. Which was really fascinating unto itself. But the other thing which your discussion really has brought up is that it contextualized. I saw myself as kind of like the tip, or at least one curl of this carpet that was unfolding.
Yes.
So it was a real contextualization. And the question I was going to ask you was, that how, and this is typical in depth psychology, the focus of individuation, working on oneself, cleaning up your own backyard before you start, complaining about someone else's garbage in their backyard, right? Psychological backyard, we'll call it that. So yeah. The idea is that nice little balance then of focusing on self and focusing on one's own context and evolution, etc., and yet at the same time not collapsing into self-centeredness. And that's the concept that, Jung made a distinction between individuation and individualization.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what you're describing is you're saying that using this geniogram or some other kinds of thing is really contextualizing the self, and by contextualizing ourselves is a way to see ourselves without becoming this self-centered or narcissistic enclosed being.
Yes, definitely. And I think it also helps you recognize things you might realize that are already in you, that you already are, like connection to land. I think sometimes in this culture, Western culture at this time, people can feel like they don't have a connection to land, and that might be projected onto other cultures or indigenous cultures. and the sense that you don't have any connection yourself. And I think that can become problematic. But if you look back, you might realize that that actually is in your roots. There is a deep sense of connection with land and place and other species, even in Western cultural roots, that we should own to some extent, so we really understand who we are and where we're coming from better.
So one of the sort of the tension points is because of the way that the humanity has been shaped over the last X hundred years, has been colonial, it has been occupational, it has been, possessive and predatorial in that way. So there's a tension in terms of, like you said, feeling part of the land. How is that, for example, with someone who is what we would call indigenous, who calls themselves indigenous, who, in the sense of not being a product of a more recent settlement? So classic is Europeans coming to North America, the American Indians here. How does someone who comes from the non-indigenous background, in the sense of coming over, is there a difference then between that kind of indigenous of being born and all the generations in a place, as opposed to someone who comes from another place and occupies the same space? Is there a difference in terms of connection to land and that perception?
I would definitely think so. I can only speak to my own experience, but I think for me it's been really important to understand my own connection to where I am at this moment, and also really just in my own roots, like understanding that, my grandparents were immigrants and came to the East Coast, the place where I don't live anymore, and how connected they became to land, and also how unrooted they were, in the sense of the fracturedness that brings psychically to who they were and how they were able to really become themselves. And I think that's something that is sort of trapped in America, especially in our psyche, of that unrootedness, being with all the immigration in the US, and many of us being from families that were have immigrants in first generation, second generation, third generation, and how that affects you psychically. I think it's important to understand ourselves that way.
How do we cultivate then a sense of connection to land, a rootedness in land? This is a particularly important because there's so much movement, forced migration of humans, forced migration of wildlife. Is there a mechanism, or how does one keep that kind of connection, or cultivate a connection to land when there's so much movement going on?
Yeah, I think that's a really hard question. For me, I've been thinking more lately about really deeply listening to the place I am, and to really information that comes every day, like responding especially to the people who are here now and the stories of where I live. Especially, I'm unrooted right now. I just moved to Washington after living in California for over a decade. So I've been thinking about this anew, I think, coming to a new place and new people, and it's given me a deeper sense of what it means to be unrooted, and the psychic shock you get when you're uprooted and placed in a new place and you don't really understand anything. And I think it's very humbling, and that's probably something that we could use a little more of in our culture, just awareness of how little we don't know, and know how much you don't know. Is this something you think about a lot in your own terms?
Yeah, it's a huge thing. I'm kind of a barnacle, I'm living in a place that, that has been in our family for 70 years. And, legend has it that I was conceived here, so I feel very much a part. That being said, I also have a sense of being a guest, because that's the perspective and the attitude that my parents brought with them when they came here. That their attitude was that they're here, they quote unquote own the land, but they're very much guests, and that in a sense of belonging comes with time, and comes with what's the right word to describe this, comes with it's not a one-way street. it comes to giving and supporting the place where you reside. So, like I said, for me, I'm like a barnacle. We now have a little sanctuary here. I'm very much rooted in that way. I think that's my natural. I'm a Cancer. So, my friends who are very, very sort of aficionados of astrology think that's quite natural. And I dwell on that quite a bit in terms of non-human animals, the deer, the displacement, and how that impacts their lives in very profound way, and how that's something, and maybe you can bring that in terms of your dissertation work, which was probably antedated by other work on wolves. That wolves have been exterminated, and we call it extirpated, but essentially they've been driven out, they don't have home, and now they're coming back. And maybe you'd like to sort of weave that in terms of place and return.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what's Western humans and wolves have always had this charged relationship. And as you point out, it's one of the few, if only, species that we've intentionally removed from the landscape or tried to. And I think, we can understand this with our relationship with wolves. We can also understand it in our relationship with other species. I like to think of it as the survivors. So those species that live so well and adapt so well to living around human communities, like raccoons and pigeons and coyotes. And you think about the amount of tension that humans tend to have with these species. It's hard to find someone that really deeply appreciates raccoons or cares about raccoons. And I think when you look at those relationships closely, you can really learn a lot about our relationship with wildness and the challenges that humans have had in really coming to terms with wildness in our own psyches. And wolves, I think, are one of the most charged places where we see that. That's why I became so interested in how people are responding to our relationship with wolves, and how, in my own work, it was around artists and how art helps us integrate that a little better, and is helping our culture to bring that information in, the insight we can gain from our relationship with wolves. I mean, the interesting thing about wolves in particular in the West, in the US, is that though they were mostly eliminated, they're actually, there was simultaneously, they've been coming back to their territory, like wandering back from Canada and coming deeper into the US. And there was also work to bring wolves back, like a lot of human intention and care to help bring wolves back into this landscape. So there's two places where we've really been working on our own consciousness with wolves, and I think it's really interesting to look at that place. And for me, because humans and wolves is such a charged topic, it's especially interesting to look at conservation communication. And when you hear people talk about wolves, there's always this sort of polarization. There's often a polarization that happens between loving wolves and hating wolves, and it feels like a place that will never move through. And that's why I became really interested in arts, because I feel like the arts are a way that we can actually integrate that a little bit better and come to terms with what has become sort of this polarization between, partly between humans and wild, and also between us and other species, between wildlands and human civilizations. This kind of extremes that we are navigating right now, especially.
Can you talk about art? Why do you think that art is such a critical or an important path for working at these interfaces and bringing some kind of understanding and resolution?
One is because I think it doesn't, it's open for interpretation. It doesn't trap us. It gives us space to integrate and to understand and to let information in. And I think it connects with us on many senses. So depending on who you are or how you respond, it provides a way for you to bring in insights into your own consciousness and unconsciousness. And I think that the way that information arises through the arts is really interesting. I mean, I think in my research, one of the most interesting things was that many of the people that I interviewed, and I looked for people in the West who were creating art about wolves. And one of the things I found was most of them were actually just kind of drawn to it for a reason they didn't quite know why, or their lives shifted synchronistically in a way where suddenly they were in places with wolves, or wolves came into their consciousness and they were moved to paint the wolves or draw wolves or write about wolves. And I think that is a really interesting aspect of wolves. It wasn't a rational or logical or conscious decision to write about it. It really just sort of entered their consciousness and they responded to it. And I think that's really interesting insight that might create a real generative way for us to learn more about ourselves.
So these individuals that you interviewed and you worked with that really are sort of the architecture of your dissertation, what was their experience, or can maybe talk about a couple examples, like when they, for example, had this, were drawn to wolves and began to paint or, do some art or whatever. Talk about what their own path was and their experience was.
The first person I interviewed actually was first or second. She'd actually grown up in Canada, and there were wolves around the community she lived in. She lived somewhat remotely and was always aware of wolves as a child and never had a fear of them. She talks about remembering her father saying not to go too far out in the woods because of the wolves, and she said she remembers specifically never being afraid of that and always feeling like that gave her comfort knowing that. But that was early in her life, and then she ended up moving to California and lived in more urban areas and had a career as a house painter. And after retirement, she got interested in wolves. She moved to Washington and started being closer to wolves, and they came more onto her consciousness, and she just was moved to start painting them. And she'd actually never painted before, and she was self-taught, so that she could, so there was this simultaneous learning to paint because of this desire to paint this particular subject. And her paintings are really incredible, and if you connect with them, you see they bring you into wolfness in a really interesting way. And for her, it was really a response to a calling more than anything else. Not especially logical or rational, just a very intuitive sense of wanting to do this and doing it, and it was very meaningful for her and meaningful.
An internal transformation? Did she shift in terms of her perception or way of being in the world after this, or through the process?
Yeah, I think she developed her own identity as an artist, which I think was a fuller expression of herself. And I think she's also seen how much impact her work has to other people when they connect with it or when they see it, and how people ask her to show her work, and people connect with it and want her to paint more, or she gets commissions. So I think there's a certain feedback of understanding, like, oh, there's a lot of meaning here in what I'm doing, and I think that feeds her work.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I remember when I traveled to Russia, talking with other scientists and things like that, and we were having this exchange of, kind of joking about it. In Russia, if you meet someone and, at a party or someone, say, oh, what do you do, for a living? The person says, well, I'm a poet, or I'm an artist, right? And then, the American response is, but I mean, what do you do for a living? There's a really difference in the culture, right? And the reason I'm bringing that up is that, do you see that the role of artists then is really, coming up from a depth psychology perspective, is really a facilitator of the unconscious, of the new consciousness that's coming out, that's evolving in a sense, because, as you said, art is untethered to any particular rational, and then we can equate that with the paradigm. It's a liberating kind of a thing. Do you see that artists then are taking on this role as agents or critical agents of a profound psychological shift?
Yeah, I do. And I think you bring up the shifting understanding in depth psychology. I think an important piece of work is by Jerome Bernstein. he wrote a book called Living in the Borderlands about the, the rise of this consciousness in our culture, and what does that mean and how can we respond to it. And I think, working as a psychologist, for him, realizing that people with this deep insight, deep sensitivity and connection with other species might not be considered, might be considered as not being as psychologically sound, or that, but in fact, they're really responding to, in a way that we should respond. Their response is a natural response to what is happening. And I think the art is one way that, especially that kind of sensitivity as it's emerging in the culture, has a channel and an outlet that's actually helping that individual on their own individuation, but also helping for a cultural individuation to happen. Which I think the arts have always had that, have always been a place where that consciousness can hide out and wait until we can even understand it. It's like the arts have always served that role as a place to hold something that we might not be able to fully integrate.
Seeds.
Yeah, the seeds are there.
So that brings around to the whole thing about how is that changing the conversation about wilderness, and how does that change the conversation about the wild?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the conservation world in general, there is a shift more towards storytelling and using the arts, because of the recognition of that being a way to tell these deeper stories. And in fact, the work of conservation, wildlife conservation or land conservation, and I think the word conservation itself is becoming outdated in a sense, but that there's a real understanding that just the actual day-to-day work, like conserving land or getting endangered species statuses put in place, that's we need to do that to keep things moving forward. But there's also this work that we have to do psychologically, individually and in our culture, that has to, if we don't do that work, the other work, we have to keep doing it indefinitely. That we have to do this foundational work and shift the way we really think about humans and our place in Western culture. I'm talking about, because this is, it's especially problematic in Western culture, this lack of interconnection, and it has far-ranging, implications that are really dangerous for the long-term health of the planet.
So when you talk about that conservation is sort of an outdated concept or outdated term, or both?
I would say I was there talking about the word. I think it'd be interesting to talk a little bit more about the concept, how we approach it. And I think we're already seeing that natural shift in conservation work towards it not being just about land or about, a particular species, but that really understanding that it doesn't even make sense to think that way about conservation anymore. It really, you can't really talk about, like wildlife habitat for a particular species if you're not also thinking about human habitat and how we make, cities more livable, or, develop in a way that keeps concentration focused so that we can actually maintain, large wildlife corridors that are intact and can support other species. So I think that is a really promising shift we see, and just thinking overall about how we approach. We have to approach our work with a sense of interconnection at its roots, because the lack of interconnection is the foundational, real foundational issue that's having a ripple effect of, endangered species or habitat loss and loss of, large numbers of particular species. We just can't separate it. If we don't, we won't get as far as we need to.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying it's, in a sense, wildlife conservation or conservation is now reflexive. So when you're talking about conservation of wildlife or habitat, it's immediately reflexive, talking about our own species and our own place and land.
Mm-hmm.
Now, are you bringing that? You said you recently moved to Washington to begin some new work. Are you bringing that approach in, or how are you bringing this approach into your role as a communications director?
The nonprofit I work at has always taken that approach, and I think it's become it's core to the work that they do, which is why I wanted to work there. I think the challenge, which is my creative challenge, is how do we communicate that out so that the people that support the work and that would be interested in the work understand why there is a connection there, to really understand why land conservation is connected to attainable housing and affordable housing in urban areas. Like why would foundationally a land-based conservation group be interested in urban housing? And it really is part of the communication challenge to help people understand that connection. And I also think that words are culture changing. The language that we use when we are communicating has serious impact in the stories we tell and how we tell them and how we actually arrange our own consciousness and evolve our own consciousness.
How can you just give an example of how you're starting to do that, or are you still in the sort of gestation period?
Yeah, well, it's a big project, but one of the things that we do is deep listening and creating places for the stories about the place to come forward, and not describe them or assume we understand them, but letting those stories tell themselves. And so one of the things we do is an arts-based event. It's a cultural event where we have about 12 to 15 artists of all kinds of media come and present their art about the place we live in, which is Washington. And I think that it's a really sort of generative and creative and inspiring event that communicates much more effectively than we ever could if we, wrote a 2-page description about the work we do. I think that having artists talk about the place and why it's important and why we want to preserve all of the species in the place itself, I think that has a lot more impact than what you might call traditional communication.
So the art, as you said, it not only untethers from a particular paradigm, but it also is experiential and participatory in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, even as an audience is participating. We don't often think of it that way, but the person who, the person who's viewing art or engaging with it is an important part of the art itself. Mm-hmm. Bringing it to life in a sense through your own consciousness as a viewer or just someone experiencing that art.
Mm-hmm. So how does one, since art and our language, et cetera, are very exclusive to other species in general, how do you use art and these kinds of activities and approaches to be inclusive of non-human nature?
There's a few. One, I think, is just to be aware of the frames of the stories we're telling. I mean, this is a piece that depth psychology has become conscious of around, say, the hero story. So I think that's one example of a shift in how we talk. This very Western idea of the hero is something that is shifting, and I think we're shifting more towards stories that show complexity and interconnection. I was just listening yesterday to an interview with Antonio Banderas, and he was talking about starting a school in Spain. And it was an arts-based school, and one of the core stories they were telling in their theater department was a chorus line, as opposed to the more traditional stories that are more like The Music Man or around one individual, but they're actually telling a story about how there's multiple people and multiple stories behind an actual creative production or a movement. And even though that it doesn't seem related to me, it felt very related, because I think culturally we're starting to see a shift in how we understand who we are and how things evolve, and how things are creative and generative is not really about one individual, but it's about all of us and how we're interconnected. And I think that relates to humans and other species as well. Like really understanding that, we live here, and we is not humans. We is all of us who live here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And do the artists that you work with, I know that you had in your dissertation, in your book that you created, you had a combination of quote unquote artists and scientists, just using those labels.
Yeah.
Do you really see a movement where artists are, I don't know how to put this, I won't say taking over, but in a sense, are these approaches starting to move into disciplines, or I don't want to just listen to disciplines, but ways of looking at things that are codified by the collective, say academia, expertise, things like that? Do you see the arts really sort of taking over in that sense as a new paradigmatic way of talking about things and approaching things?
I mean, I think that we're making space for art more, and I know there's been a cultural shift to resources being taken away from art, but I think we are seeing a shift in making space for art and bringing art more into public places. And one thing with scientists that I interviewed, for a number of them, when you're a scientist, and you could probably speak to this, Gay, in particular, there's certain expectations of being in that paradigm as a scientist. And so certain information that is coming to you in non-rational ways does not necessarily have a place in your work. But that it's curious to me when I often meet biologists or scientists who have an art practice, and the art practice is in fact a place for them to express this other information that they're getting in their work that the current science, paradigm of science and how it's practiced doesn't give space for, but that for them, they really recognize the value of their painting or their writing or their poetry as a place to talk about this insight that they got that didn't have a place in their traditional scientific work. But I mean, you've bridged multiple worlds, so perhaps you've experienced that yourself.
Well, it recalls another memory where when I was a research mathematician with the government, and I was working with the forests and salmon, and this is up in Oregon, and there was a woman who was doing a PhD from Yale. I don't even remember her name. And she was interviewing all sorts of people. This was during the spotted owl time situation. And so she was interviewing all the scientists, she was interviewing loggers, she was interviewing community, etc., to get sort of a feel for what they're feeling for land, they're feeling for the forests in that way. So she interviewed me, and I just said, well, you don't have to give names or anything. I said, I'm just curious. What are the responses that you're getting from, the scientists in that way? One of the questions she was asking was, describe to me what you think is the most beautiful forest, or, what is really beautiful about forest. And she said, well, actually the majority, they were men. I was unusual because there was only a couple women in the group that I was with, which was quite large. But she said the majority of the men start crying. Everyone breaks down. And that always stayed with me. It was sort of like there's no room for grief. There's no room for these other feelings, that everything is cookie cut out, which I also see as a profound problem, quote unquote, generating a lot of grief in the sense of issues and misdiagnosed approaches to things because those things have been excluded in that way. The other thing is I was thinking about is in arts, we've been talking about painting and things like that, but also movement, body-centered art, what we would call dance or, performance art. Are you working with individuals like that? And how do you see that? I mean, I see that as such an important component in this movement because it really is it is place, being in the body. That's another part of place and land that has been ignored or excised. And the other is it is in the embodiment, and being embodied is very much the way I perceive non-human nature, animals and other beings are embodied. They don't, get up and go and dissociate in that way. Are you bringing that in as well?
I haven't worked specifically with dancers or somatic workers, but I think what you're saying is absolutely true. And I think that's why field work was really important in my research, and mostly I was moving and outside moving and experiencing. And I think you're absolutely right. And I think that connection with the body and that disconnection from the body is a real core issue in our isolation from other species. One thing, what you were saying brought to mind a memory of, I used to be, when I was a nature guy with first and second graders, part of the obligation of the program sometimes was you had to teach very specific information, very particular facts the kids had to come away with. And this didn't really resonate with my own orientation. I'm not very good at advising plant names. So on the last day, I knew I was going to move on. I had to go do field work. So I said, today we're just going to wander through the woods and just respond however we feel like responding, which with second graders can be quite fun because they'll be distracted by any kind of sense coming from anywhere. And we took this walk. We were actually walking through Muir Woods, an old ancient redwood grove outside of San Francisco. And we didn't even talk a lot. We spoke very little, and we really just wandered. And at the end of the walk, I asked the kids, what I always ask them was, what was your favorite part of the day? And this one little boy looked me in the eye and said with the most straight face, when we saw the wolves. And I thought, wow, I had to ask him to say it again. What did he say? Like, when we saw the wolves, that was the best part. And I thought, no mention was made of wolves. Clearly wolves have lived there at some, in the last, few hundred years, not in our time, obviously, but, I thought that was a really profound moment of really thinking, he may have actually seen a wolf in a sense, in his own mind, but that they were the sense of understanding what that place was about and what life had lived there and what it means to be, what wolf even means symbolically to us as humans. I thought it was a very interesting, gave me deep insight, I think, into how we respond to place and to how we move through places.
That's an amazing story. That's absolutely, I love that. It's amazing. Well, the other thing is that, that we've talked about is, in terms of what you're talking about of interconnections and bridging these things that are perceived gaps, et cetera. And one of the concepts that has come up and been formalized by someone we know and love, Mary Watkins, is accompaniment. And that came to mind also when you were with the children. And, you even though, as they were wandering, you were wandering with them, staying with them in the sense of their experience. Talk about accompaniment and how that is also relating to some of the work that you're bringing forward.
I think you could speak to this very well, but for me, I think as a community psychologist, one of the important pieces of the work is to really understand what the role of a psychologist is, and really shifting the away from that paradigm of the psychologist as being all-knowing and coming in with answers to help solve a problem. And a community psychologist orientation is very distinct from that. And it really is, I think, can be well defined as an accompanier. You are coming forward with yourself as an individual with all the skills you have, what you understand, and bringing actively everything you have, but doing that in a way that is also side by side with the community that you are there to accompany. And Mary Watkins talks about it as psychosocial, just to make the point that it's on multiple levels that you are working as an accompanier. How are you using your skills to help make policy change or social change, but also personal change, and a real practical way to accompany, but also in a very deep, showing up in a very deep way with that organization. And I think bringing that idea into how we think about our relationship with other species is a really useful way to think about how we might start to connect again with other species in Western culture. I think that because we don't speak the same languages per se, and because of the being in different cultures, accompaniment is one of the ways you can actually think about how that might look. You know, how might I accompany wolves, since I can't, you know, I might never see one in my lifetime, and may not fully be able to understand wolf culture. How could I still show up and accompany wolfness in a way that feels respectful and not problematic? And how have you thought about that? You know,
For that, I had to ask you, what do you feel is because you have been working with wolves for many years? How are you, which I know you are accompanying them. How are you accompanying them, and what does that look like? This would also help people understand the concept of accompaniment, which is, you know, it's kind of like sustainability. It's kind of hard to describe. And partly the reason it's so hard to describe is because it doesn't exist as a perceptual / ethical way of being in our dominating culture. So talk about accompaniment, how you are accompanying and have accompanied wolves.
Mm-hmm. I think when wolves first came into my consciousness, for me, I realized I didn't understand wolves. I didn't understand wolves on just a lived sense, like what wolfness is, what wolf life is like. So I made work to understand that better. And then also understanding the situation between humans and wolves. So I really did not understand that history, and making a point to really learn that history of humans and wolves, which is very painful. Which is a painful process to have to take in. You know, that's which anyone involved with, animal rights or working with other species has to at some point take in some painful reality of our relationship with other species. So I think that's an important part, simply shifting your own awareness of the lived experience. So for me, that was important with wolves. And then really thinking, now that I understand this, how can I understand better what it could look like? So then I did field work by going to a wolf sanctuary and really looking at a place where humans were actually trying to make peace, in a sense, with our relationship with wolves. And what did that look like? And then also talking to those people and trying to understand, what is wolfness to you? Like, you have a much closer relationship with wolves than most humans. What is wolfness? And one of the interesting stories about that fieldwork was when I was videoing all of the people who worked there at this particular sanctuary, and asking them to describe wolves. So I wanted to get a better phenomenological sense of wolfness. In almost every video, at a moment when they asked them that, a wolf would walk into the scene, come up as close as they could get and start howling or walking through. And I thought it was a really interesting shift in understanding how we interact, or this ongoing question, how do we communicate with another species in their language? And I think, so moving deeper into that work, in that field work, and getting closer to wolves and trying to understand wolfness, and then understanding with my own skill set, what could I do? So then making the decision that my dissertation would be focused on wolves. And that part of that work would be a sort of delivering a return of something, like the creation of an exhibit that brings together all this art about wolves to help others understand, like, wolfness and what it might be in a non-polarizing way, like not really just presenting wolfness as it has been communicated in art.
Mm-hmm. So it really, again, from a depth psychological perspective, through that project and the work that you're doing, when you talk about the wolfness, it's rediscovering that territory, that land, if you want to call it that way, the psychological land which dwells with wolves, that is intrinsic to us all. Maybe more or less. For example, maybe for you it's wolf, for someone it's an elephant, for someone it's a ground squirrel, or whatever. But that is sort of resuscitating and revitalizing the land in which we live inside of ourselves, and understanding that, and at the same time, which I know that you have underscored in your work, is retaining that kind of perspective so that the wolf doesn't turn into just a symbol.
Mm-hmm.
That there is a real, this is a Hillman type of thing, is that there's a real wolf, and one should never forget the real wolf. But nonetheless, there is a space of connection of wolf, quote unquote, human, which is part of you, part of him or her in that way. Yeah,
and that's been something that's been always a North Star for me, is the point you bring up about the real wolf. That's something that Margot McLean talks about in Animal Dreams, of like, you must never forget the fox under the porch. That there is we do have a relationship with other species that is beyond just the lived experience, which is real and is a point of connection. And there is also a lived experience, and there really is a fox under the porch, or there could be or should be. These are pieces that are not separated. They're not one or the other. Keeping them separate and not being conscious of either of them would be thinking in the same problematic paradigm that created this situation, problems that we are having. But I think it's part of our work to integrate all of that in one, and to understand that's all part of who we are and who wolves are, and our relationship with them is all of that in one. And
yeah, it reminds me again, you talked about Jerome Bernstein, and which I thought was just phenomenal. It's in his book, but it came out as an article when he was working with a client. He's a psychoanalyst, Jungian, and he was working with a client that he called her Hannah. And, she was talking about very emotionally how on her way to session, if I'm remembering this correctly, on her way to session, she had been behind this truck that was carrying cows. And she was very upset, and she was sharing that with him. And this is what I love about Jerome. I mean, he's this extraordinary person, is that, and he said, he kind of gave his usual, what does the cow mean to you in your traumatic past, et cetera, and then, very uncharacteristically, she just kind of got more and more frustrated and kind of screamed at him, yelled, it's the cows,
Yeah.
And I think that is a fascinating, and I don't mean to make it sound academic, it is a critical point of moving into the transrational space, which this little boy at Muir Woods did. I mean, in the sense of the wolf, what we call transrational, the wolf was there. And also at the same time, respecting the vessel that holds the wolfness in that way. And I think that's a really difficult space and point to be for Westerners in that way. And it sounds like your work is really trying to express and reveal that in an operational way of the kind of art you're doing, and the kind of bringing in the quote unquote conservation in that way.
Yes, I think that's why art, I think, has become so critical to that work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Susan. I think I could ask you 5,000 more questions, but Liz would, put me in the proverbial doghouse.
Yeah, thank you so much, Susan, and Kay, of course, for your wonderful questions. I think it's wonderful that you brought into this space wildlife and art, because I think that so many of us tend to forget that wildlife does create art in its own way. If anyone's ever seen the interior design skills of a bower bird, for example, or dances that animals do in courtship, I definitely think that that's something to remember, that we are partly in our wildness when we are creating art. So thank you so much for bringing that to the fore. So before we turn off the recording and switch to questions, I do want to do a quick plug for next month. So next month, please join us. It's actually the second Sunday at noon. It's going to be March 8th. We're going to be welcoming Zoe Weil. She's co-founder and president of the Institute for Humane Education. So we hope you'll join us. Alrighty.